One question that is coming up a lot is how to implement buyer agreements when it comes to open houses. So I just wanted to point this out. Open houses are a little different. It's a public event that's being hosted on behalf of the seller by the listing agent. And this means that in most cases, consumers don't need to sign a buyer agency agreement to attend the open house. There is a little bit of gray area here. There are some nuances that may require you to sign an agency agreement for that one particular house or that one particular day. But in general, you should feel comfortable as a buyer attending an open house without representation. I did want to discuss a little bit more the agreements that oversee a real estate transaction. We've already mentioned the listing agreement, which is signed between the seller and their agent for representation. There's also a buyer agreement that is signed between the buyer and their agent. And the third agreement is actually the purchase agreement. The purchase and sales agreement is the terms of exchange, and it is completed between the seller and the buyer, and it articulates the details of the transaction and what needs to happen. So these are the three agreements that govern all real estate transactions. The seller and the listing agent signed a listing agreement, the buyer and the buyer agent sign a buyer agreement, and the seller and the buyer sign a purchase agreement. All right, so I mentioned that there are three major changes we've discussed. We've discussed the first, which is representation. Moving forward, buyers will be required to enter into a formal agreement called a buyer agency agreement before touring homes. The second change is related to a decoupling of compensation, and it's a bit more complex. I think once I break it down for you, you'll understand very quickly, so let's get right to it. We're going to talk again about what happened in the past and what will happen in the future. So in the past, a seller wants to put their property on the market, and to do so, there's their house. They want to put it on the market for $500,000, and they agree to pay a total commission to their listing agent of $30,000. $500,000 for the house, $30,000 in commission. The listing, this is the $30,000 they've agreed to pay the listing agent. The listing agent decides they're going to keep, and they agree with the seller on this, $20,000 of that commission for themselves, and they're going to share the other $10,000 with the buyer's agent. This is called cooperative compensation, and this is the way it's been done in the past. This shared cooperating compensation has been a fundamental process within real estate. It allows agents to cooperate in order to achieve the best results for their clients, and this is the way it's been done in the past. Now, I do want to add a little bit of a clarifying data. All commissions are paid actually to the broker or the brokerage, not directly to the agents. I'm saying agents for simplicity's sake, but just be aware that all payment happens to the brokerage, and then the brokerage pays out their agents. So just to clarify one more time, sellers sign a listing agreement with their agent to sell their house for $500,000, and they've agreed to $30,000 in commission. The listing agent and the seller agree that the listing agent will keep $20,000 of that $30,000, and they will share the additional $10,000 to the buyer's agent, and this is called cooperative compensation. All right, so moving forward, the industry is working towards decoupling of commission. In essence, this means the listing agent is still going to work for the seller, and the seller is still going to pay the listing agent for their representation. The difference is that change is really happening on the buyer side. Moving forward, there are 4 different ways a buyer can compensate their agent. Scenario number 1 is that the seller will still pay the listing agent their portion, $20,000 or whatever's outlined in their listing agreement, And the seller will also pay the buyer's agent directly as part of the purchase and sales agreement. This is the most similar to the past, the only difference being the seller is paying the buyer's agent directly instead of passing it through the agent. So instead of it going from the seller to the listing agent, then over to the buyer, you'll see here the seller is still paying their listing agent and then they're paying the buyer's agent directly. The second scenario, the seller continues to pay their listing agent, so their $20,000, but the buyer then directly pays at the time of closing their buyer agent. So this is called a seller or buyer directed compensation. So everyone pays their own agent based on their own formal representation and agency agreements. The third scenario could be a combination scenario where the seller pays the listing agent and the seller offers a little bit to the buyer's agent, and the buyer pays their own agent as well. So this is a combination. The seller may pay the buyer agent a portion of what they're required to pay, but the buyer then pays the remainder. And actually, this scenario often happened in the past, especially if the buyer agency agreement articulated a specific commission, which it should, and the seller was offering less than that cooperating compensation. So let's just look at this example. So let's say my buyer agency agreement with my buyer said that I was going to get $20,000, and that's what the buyer was willing to pay me for representation. But the listing agent in this past scenario was only offering $10,000. That would be a scenario where number 3 would happen. The seller was paying a portion of the buyer agent's fee, and the buyer was paying the remainder. And then there's the final scenario. And the final scenario occurs when the seller still pays the listing agent, as always, but offers a concession to the buyer that can be applied to any of the buyer's out-of-pocket expenses, including but not limited to the buyer agent compensation. So let's do a little vocabulary. A concession is an adjustment in the terms of exchange. It can include things like leaving the lawnmower, extending the closing date, anything like that is considered a concession. In this case, the seller would be offering a financial concession that the buyer then can utilize to pay their agent. So for example, I'm offering $10,000 towards the buyer's closing costs, escrows, buyer agency. They're offering them a concession of cash that they could then use to pay their agent. Now, you might be saying, well, how is this different than scenario 1? And really, the only difference is that instead of the seller paying the buyer's agent directly, the seller is giving the buyers a concession, and then the buyers decide how to utilize those funds. So, what is the major impact? Do you see it yet? The bottom line is there is no longer cooperating compensation. Moving forward, all compensation will need to be buyer or seller directed. There's no more sharing of compensation. There's no more of it happening kind of behind the scenes. As the listing agent, I negotiate commission with the seller, and as a buyer's agent, I negotiate my commission with the buyer. If the buyer needs support in paying my fee, then the buyer and seller, with the help of their representative agents, negotiate that in the terms of exchange or the purchase and sales.